He didn't come to the Galactic Clinic to become a medical marvel. He just wanted a standard patch job for a torn arm. But when the physician ran the diagnostic scanner, the machine choked. Alarm screamed. The doctor stared at the readout, his skin paling to a sickening chalky gray. "You have corrosive industrial metal pumping through your vascular system," the healer whispered, backing away from the exam table. "How are you not dead? If you love grounded sci-fi, stick around to find out." The clinic smelled like burnt hair and industrial bleach. It was a smell Wyatt had grown used to out on the fringes, the scent of cheap sanitizers struggling to mask the underlying odor of 100 different species sweating in close proximity. He sat on a rigid plastic chair that was designed for a spine with 3 extra joints, shifting his weight to keep his legs from going numb. His right arm throbbed, a steady, rhythmic pulse of pain that kept time with his heartbeat. He had wrapped it in a dirty mechanic's rag 2 hours ago when the coupling on the cargo loader snapped, taking a chunk of his forearm with it. The rag was soaked through, the deep red of his blood turning the gray fabric black. Above him, a light fixture buzzed like a dying wasp. It flickered, casting harsh, stroboscopic shadows across the waiting room. 3 seats down, a frail, spindly alien with translucent skin was coughing up something that looked like blue chalk. Wyatt looked away. He didn't care. He was just tired. He had been hauling irradiated freight for 14 hours. His boots were filled with leaden fatigue, and the grit in his eyes felt like crushed glass. "Wyatt." The voice came through the translation collar at his throat, a synthetic flat tone that robbed the speaker of any emotion. Wyatt looked up. The receptionist, a squat, broad-shouldered being wearing a name tag that translated to Toby, was glaring at him. "Room 4. Dr. Corbin will see you," Wyatt grunted, pushing himself off the uncomfortable chair. His boots scuffed against the scuffed linoleum floor, leaving faint rust-colored flakes where the dried blood had flaked off his rag. He pushed through the swinging door into the sterile hallway. It was colder back here. The air scrubbers were working overtime, pushing a dry, chilled breeze against his sweat-stained collar. Room 4 was a stark, white box. The exam table in the center was made of a cold, brushed alloy. Wyatt hopped up onto it, wincing as the movement pulled at the torn meat in his arm. He unwrapped the rag. The wound wasn't pretty. The loader's rusted gear had chewed through the dermal layers, exposing the fat and muscle beneath. It was oozing slowly. The door slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss. Dr. Corbin walked in. Corbin was humanoid enough to not be startling. Bipedal, 2 arms, a face with eyes and a mouth. But his skin was a muted shade of olive green, and his eyes lacked pupils, solid pools of amber. He wore a crisp white coat that looked ridiculously pristine in this rundown sector. "Human," Corbin said, looking down at a data pad. His voice, run through the translator, had a clipped, professional cadence. "You are far from your sector." "Just passing through," Wyatt muttered. "Need a patch job. Bio-glue, synthetic weave, whatever you got. I have a shift in 4 hours." Corbin finally looked up from the pad and set his amber eyes on Wyatt's arm. The alien paused. A small, involuntary shudder rippled through his shoulders. "That is a significant laceration. The fluid loss is substantial. I will need to run a localized scan to ensure no toxins entered the breach." "It's just a cut," Wyatt said, his patience thinning. "Stitch it, glue it." I'm not paying for a full-body diagnostic. Standard procedure for out-system species, Corbin replied, his tone brooking no argument. He pulled a heavy metallic scanner from a wall mount. It looked like a barcode reader mated with a flashlight. Hold still, Corbin passed the device over Wyatt's bleeding arm. The machine hummed, a low vibration that Wyatt could feel in his teeth. Then, it stopped humming. The device emitted a sharp, high-pitched shriek. Corbin dropped it. The scanner clattered against the metal table, its indicator lights flashing a violent, strobe-like crimson. The doctor scrambled backward, his back hitting the sterile white wall. His olive skin visibly drained, turning a sickly, washed-out gray. "What?" Wyatt asked, looking from the screaming machine to the terrified doctor. "Is it infected? I washed it with engine solvent." Corbin didn't answer. He was staring at the small, holographic display projecting from the fallen scanner. He reached out with a trembling four-fingered hand and tapped a sequence into his datapad, syncing the scanner's readout. "This is an error," Corbin whispered, his actual voice bleeding through the translator, carrying a reedy, panicked edge. "The calibration is shattered." "Doc, it's a cut." Wyatt reached over and pressed the power button on the scanner. The shrieking stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hum of the air scrubbers. "Are you going to fix it or not?" Corbin swallowed hard. He looked at the blood dripping from Wyatt's arm onto the floor. "The scanner is detecting massive, lethal concentrations of a highly reactive industrial compound in your vascular system. It says your life fluid is saturated with it." Wyatt sighed, wiping a smear of blood off his knuckles. "What compound?" Corbin looked at his pad, his amber eyes wide. "Ferrum. You call it iron." "Iron," Wyatt repeated. He stared blankly at the alien doctor. "Yeah, iron. So?" Corbin pressed himself harder against the wall, as if trying to merge with the drywall. "So, human. Iron is a heavy metal. It is highly reactive. It oxidizes upon contact with moisture and air, creating corrosive byproducts. We use it to build starship hulls and heavy ballistics. We do not pump it through our internal organs." Wyatt felt a headache building right behind his eyes. The dull throb in his arm was getting worse, a sharp, stinging reminder that he was still actively bleeding. "It's hemoglobin, Doc. It carries oxygen. It's how we breathe." Corbin stared at him like he had just claimed to breathe raw plasma. "Oxygen? You introduce a highly combustible, corrosive gas into your respiratory system and use a rapidly oxidizing heavy metal to transport it through your tissues? I don't know the exact chemistry, but yeah, that's the gist." Wyatt swung his legs off the table, annoyed. "Look, if you don't have the stomach for it, just give me the medical tape and I'll do it myself." "Do not move," Corbin snapped, raising a hand. He hurried over to a biohazard cabinet set into the wall and punched in a code. The heavy glass door slid open, and Corbin pulled out a pair of thick, elbow-length, lead-lined gloves. He shoved his hands into them. "Your biology is a walking containment breach. If that fluid, that blood, oxidizes on my equipment, it could eat through the sterilization plating." "It's just blood," Wyatt said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous growl. He was tired of being treated like a freak. He was broke, he was hungry, and he was hurt. The absolute last thing he needed was a biology lesson from an alien who looked like a stiff breeze would snap his spine. "To you, perhaps," Corbin said, approaching the table cautiously. He kept his gloved hands raised, as if approaching a volatile explosive. My species, and most of the galactic concord, utilize copper-based proteins, hemocyanin. It is stable. It is gentle. It regulates temperature and maintains a delicate internal pH. Iron is violent. It tears through cellular walls. The sheer oxidative stress your cells must endure just to survive your own circulatory system is monstrous. Wyatt looked down at his arm. The blood was starting to congeal, forming a dark, sticky crust around the edges of the laceration. He thought about Earth. He thought about the gravity that pulled at his bones, the unfiltered sunlight that burned his skin, the microscopic parasites in the water that constantly tried to hollow him out. He had never thought of himself as a monster. He was just a guy trying to make rent on a miserable rock. "Well, we survived it," Wyatt muttered. "Can you patch it or not?" Corbin swallowed. He picked up a pair of surgical forceps, keeping a healthy distance between his body and Wyatt's arm. He poked at the torn muscle. Wyatt gritted his teeth, his jaw muscles clenching, but he didn't make a sound. Corbin stopped and looked at Wyatt's face. "Your pain receptors, they are firing, yes?" "Yeah, it hurts like hell. But you are not entering systemic shock. Your heart rate has elevated only marginally. A Veltrac with a comparable injury would be comatose to prevent neural overload." "We don't have that luxury," Wyatt said, his voice tight. "You pass out on a rig, you get crushed. Just fix the damn arm." Corbin moved to the counter and prepared a vial of clear, viscous fluid. "I cannot use standard dermal regenerators. They are designed for copper-based systems. The introduction of synthetic copper proteins into an iron-rich environment would cause a violent galvanic reaction. Your arm would literally fry itself." Wyatt blinked. "Okay, that sounds bad. What's the alternative?" "Physical closure," Corbin said, picking up a curved, wicked-looking needle and a spool of thick black thread. "I will have to suture the tissue manually. I do not have anesthetics tailored for your nervous system. Standard numbing agents might trigger cardiac arrest in a species with your aggressive metabolism." Wyatt stared at the needle. It looked like something used to repair leather boots. He sighed, a long, exhausted sound, and leaned his head back against the wall. "Do it." The first pierce of the needle felt like a hornet sting, hot and sharp. Wyatt closed his eyes. He focused on the hum of the air scrubbers. In, out, the steady rhythm of the machine. He smelled the ozone. He smelled the chemical cleaners. And now, beneath it all, he smelled the distinct, heavy tang of rust. Corbin was working quickly, but his movements were stiff. He was terrified. Wyatt could hear the doctor's shallow, rapid breathing. Every time the thick thread pulled taut, closing the torn meat, Corbin flinched slightly. "Your tissue density is absurd," Corbin muttered, more to himself than to Wyatt. The translator rendered the tone as strained. "I am having to apply significant kinetic force just to push the needle through the dermal layers. It is like stitching synth hide." "Work outdoors long enough, your skin thickens up," Wyatt said, keeping his eyes closed. The pain was sharp, but manageable. It wasn't the worst he'd had. A plasma burn back on the Jupiter shipyards had taken a layer of skin off his thigh. That had hurt. This was just mechanical. "It is not just environmental adaptation," Corbin corrected, his hands moving with trembling precision. "It is structural. The calcium density of your skeletal structure, the tensile strength of your muscle fibers. Your gravity must be crushing. Standard 1G. For the Concord, standard is 0.4, Corbin replied. Anything above 0.6 is classified as a hostile high-gravity environment. You evolved in a meat grinder, human. Wyatt opened his eyes. Corbin was leaning close, tying off a knot. Up close, the alien doctor looked older. There were fine web-like lines around his amber eyes. He looked exhausted, too. We didn't think of it like that, Wyatt said softly. It was just home. You fought the dirt. You fought the weather. You fought the animals. If you lost, you died. If you won, you got to wake up and do it again. Corbin snipped the thread. He stepped back, stripping the heavy lead-lined gloves off with a wet schlock sound. He threw them into the biohazard incinerator chute. I have sealed the primary laceration, Corbin said, wiping a sheen of sweat from his forehead with the back of his bare hand. I will apply a neutral saline bandage. It will not accelerate healing, but it will prevent external infection. Thanks, Wyatt said. He looked at his arm. A neat, tight row of black stitches tracked across the pale skin. It throbbed angrily, but the bleeding had stopped. He rolled his shoulder, testing the tension. It held. Corbin moved to the terminal on the wall, his fingers flying across the holographic keys. I am logging this encounter into the medical database. The Concord needs to be aware of the biochemical hazard humans present in standard medical facilities. Wyatt slid off the table. His boots hit the floor with a heavy thud. He pulled his dirty jacket off the chair and slung it over his good shoulder. Hazard, right. So I shouldn't expect a lollipop? Corbin paused, turning to look at him. The doctor's expression was unreadable, the amber eyes flat and alien, but the translator carried a note of something resembling awe. You misunderstand me, Wyatt. It is not just a hazard. It is a revelation. The iron in your blood, the oxygen in your lungs, the gravity that forged your bones. You are walking, breathing anomalies of endurance. A Veltrac dies from a microscopic imbalance of copper. A human bleeds liquid industrial metal and asks to go back to work. Wyatt pulled a crumpled credit chit from his pocket and tossed it onto the metal table. It clattered loudly in the quiet room. Keep the change, Doc, Wyatt said. He turned toward the door. We're not anomalies. We're just stubborn. He pushed through the sliding door, stepping back into the chilled, sterile hallway. The ache in his arm was settling into a dull, manageable burn. He had 4 hours until his shift on the cargo docks. If he hurried, he could grab a synthetic coffee and maybe an hour of sleep in his bunk. As the door hissed shut behind him, Wyatt looked down at his hand. There was a smear of dried blood on his thumb. He rubbed it against his index finger. It felt gritty, like rust, like earth. He shoved his hand in his pocket and walked away. The lower promenade of Station Kalen 9 didn't have a day-night cycle. It just had varying degrees of gloom. The overhead lumens were perpetually dimmed to a jaundiced yellow, supposedly to mimic the twilight of the station administrator's homeworld. But Wyatt knew the truth. It was cheaper. Less power output meant fewer credits burned on the auxiliary fusion core. Wyatt walked with his head down, navigating the crowded thoroughfare through muscle memory. He kept his right arm tucked close to his ribs. The localized anesthetic Corbin hadn't given him was sorely missed. Every step sent a jolt of fire up his bicep. The black thread pulled tight against his skin, a foreign, itchy intrusion. He stopped at a vending kiosk, wedged between a pawn shop and a depressurized airlock. The machine was dented, covered in graffiti written in 4 different alphabets. He slapped his credit chit against the grimy sensor. The machine wheezed, clanked, and spat out a thermo cup of black sludge. They called it coffee. It tasted like burnt chicory steeped in battery acid, but it had enough synthetic caffeine to jumpstart a dead engine. Wyatt took a sip, grimacing as the scalding liquid stripped a layer of cells off his tongue. It grounded him. He had an hour before his shift. His bunk was 3 levels down in the high-density habitation blocks. The air down there was stale, reeking of recycled breath and cheap ozone filters. He slid his keycard into the rusty slot of Unit 412. The door dragged open with a metallic squeal. The room was barely larger than a coffin. A cot, a sonic shower that only worked on Tuesdays, and a locker. Wyatt sat on the edge of the cot, the mattress springs groaning in protest. He stared at the blank gray wall. He was so deeply, profoundly tired. It was a weariness that lived in his marrow. The humans out here on the fringe were all running on fumes. They were the cheap labor, the brute force. The Galactic Concord had technology that could fold space and terraform dead moons, but when it came to hauling heavy, dangerous, or toxic cargo in poorly maintained facilities, it was always cheaper to hire a human. Their bones didn't snap under standard grav loads. Their lungs could filter out minor industrial pollutants, and their immune systems, forged in the chaotic biological soup of Earth, could take a beating that would liquefy a Veltrac. Wyatt lay back, resting his head on the thin pillow. He closed his eyes. The throb in his arm was a metronome. Thump, thump, thump. He tried to sleep, but his mind wouldn't quiet down. He kept seeing Corbin's face, the absolute terror in those amber eyes. "You bleed liquid industrial metal," Wyatt scoffed in the quiet room. It was just blood. It was just life. The galaxy was too soft. His comms link chimed, a shrill, piercing noise that shattered the silence. Shift time. Wyatt groaned, forcing himself upright. His joints popped, a symphony of minor complaints. He downed the rest of his cold, sludgy coffee, grabbed his heavy work gloves, and headed for the docks. Cargo Bay 7 was a cavernous expanse of raw industrial chaos. The noise was a physical entity here. It slammed into you the moment you walked through the pressure doors. The shrieking grind of metal on metal, the explosive hiss of pneumatic locks, the low bone-rattling bass of the anti-grav lifters. The air tasted of engine grease and ionized copper. Wyatt found his crew huddled near loading Ramp B. Voss, the shift foreman, was pacing. Voss was a chitin, a species that looked like a praying mantis scaled up to the size of a grizzly bear. His dark exoskeleton clicked and clattered as he moved. "You are late," Voss chattered, the translator collar on his thorax rendering his clicks into harsh, synthesized basic. "I'm on time, Voss," Wyatt said, pulling his thick leather gloves on. He was careful with his right arm. Barely, but on time. Voss's multifaceted eyes swiveled toward Wyatt's arm, locking onto the blood-stained sleeve of his jacket. "You are leaking. I cannot have biocontaminants on the freight." "I've been patched. It's dry," Wyatt lied. The bandage beneath his jacket was already damp with a fresh weep of blood, irritated by his walk down to the docks. "What's the haul today?" "Refined plasma coils," Voss clicked, his mandibles twitching. "Destined for the core worlds. They are heavy. They are volatile. The magnetic tethers on the lifters have been malfunctioning. You will load them manually into the cargo bays of the hauler. Wyatt stared at the foreman. Manually? Those coils weigh 200 kilos empty. Which is why you are here, human, Voss stated, pointing a jagged, serrated limb toward the staging area. The lifters will bring them to the ramp. You will push them into the docking clamps. Do not drop them. The impact will trigger a localized plasma discharge. Great, so if it falls, I vaporize. Do not let it fall, Voss replied, entirely missing the sarcasm. Get to work. Wyatt walked toward the ramp. The hauler was a massive, ugly ship, its hull scarred by micrometeorites and stellar radiation. The cargo bay doors were open, revealing a dark, cavernous belly. Next to Wyatt was a young Veltrak named Ryan. Ryan was maybe 20 Earth years old, with pale blue skin that looked thin as parchment and large, nervous black eyes. Veltraks were notoriously fragile, relying heavily on exosuits for physical labor. Ryan's suit was humming softly, taking the brunt of Kalen 9's gravity. Wyatt, Ryan said, his voice a soft, musical trill. Your arm. Are you functioning optimally? I'm fine, kid, Wyatt grunted, taking his position on the left side of the ramp. Just keep your suit stabilizers locked. We don't want a repeat of last week. Ryan shuddered. Last week, a different Veltrak had blown a knee actuator on their suit and been crushed beneath a crate of hydroponic soil. It hadn't been pretty. The first anti-grav lifter hummed toward them, carrying a massive cylindrical plasma coil. The metal casing was dull and gray, but a faint blue light pulsed from the seams. It smelled like an impending thunderstorm. The lifter halted at the edge of the ramp. It was up to them now. Wyatt planted his boots on the grooved deck. He pressed his good shoulder against the cold metal of the coil. Ryan moved to the other side, his exosuit whining as it engaged. On 3, Wyatt said. 1, 2, 3, push. Wyatt drove his legs forward. The coil resisted for a second, then slid heavily across the deck toward the docking clamps. The strain tore through his right arm. The stitches screamed against the tearing muscle. Wyatt bit down on the inside of his cheek, tasting the familiar, sharp tang of iron. He didn't stop. He pushed, because if he stopped, the coil would slide backward, and Ryan's suit wouldn't be able to hold the weight. They locked the first coil into the clamps. Wyatt stepped back, breathing hard. Sweat stung his eyes. He looked at his right sleeve. A dark, wet patch was blooming through the heavy canvas. 1 down, Ryan chirped cheerfully. Only 49 remaining. Wyatt looked at the line of coils waiting on the staging floor. He spat a wad of blood onto the deck. Yeah, Wyatt muttered. Only 49. By the 30th coil, Wyatt was operating entirely on autopilot. Conscious thought had dissolved into a primal rhythm of exertion and endurance. Plant boots, grip casing, brace core, push, lock, repeat. The air in the cargo bay had grown sweltering, thick with the heat radiating from the ship's idle engines and the pulsing plasma cores. Wyatt had shed his canvas jacket 2 hours ago, tossing it into a corner. He was working in a sweat-soaked gray undershirt. The bandage on his right forearm was ruined. The white gauze had turned a deep, rusty crimson. A few of the black stitches Corbin had painstakingly sewn had popped under the sheer torque of pushing 200-kilo cylinders. Blood was running in a slow, steady trickle down his wrist, pooling in the palm of his leather work glove, making his grip slick. Ryan was faring worse, despite the exosuit. The Veltrac was panting, his pale blue skin flushed with a feverish purple hue. The hydraulic fluid in Ryan's suit was starting to smell scorched, a sharp chemical odor cutting through the ozone. "Take a breather, kid," Wyatt rasped, leaning heavily against the bulkhead as the lifter approached with coil 31. "Your actuators are running hot." "We are behind schedule," Ryan wheezed, his large black eyes wide with anxiety. "Foreman Voss will dock our credits. My family requires the remittance." "Voss can eat a spark plug," Wyatt growled. He wiped his forehead with the back of his left hand, smearing engine grease across his brow. "Let the lifter idle. 5 minutes." But the lifter didn't idle. The automated drone driving the anti-grav sled was old, its sensory optics cloudy with dust and microscopic scoring. Instead of stopping at the staging line, it kept moving, its repulsor engines whining a pitch higher than normal. "Hey!" Wyatt shouted, pushing off the bulkhead. "Cut the drive!" The drone didn't respond. It accelerated slightly, trundling directly toward Ryan. Ryan froze. It was a prey response, deeply ingrained in the Veltrac biology. When faced with overwhelming force, their nervous system simply locked up, waiting for the end. The alien stood dead center on the ramp, staring blankly as the sled and its massive payload bore down on him. "Ryan, move!" Wyatt bellowed. The kid didn't twitch. Wyatt didn't have time to think. He didn't have time to calculate mass, velocity, or the structural integrity of his own bones. He just moved. He lunged across the ramp, his boots skidding slightly on a patch of leaked coolant. He hit Ryan with his left shoulder, tackling the fragile alien hard around the midsection. The impact knocked them both out of the drone's path, sending them sprawling onto the hard, grooved decking. But they weren't clear. As the drone sped past them, its magnetic tether system, already failing from the start of the shift, finally gave out. The warning klaxons didn't even have time to sound. With a sharp metallic crack, the tethers snapped. The massive 200-kilo plasma coil rolled off the sled. Gravity, absolute and unforgiving, took over. The cylinder plummeted toward the deck, rolling violently toward where Wyatt and Ryan lay tangled on the floor. Ryan shrieked. Wyatt scrambled up to his knees. The coil was coming fast, a juggernaut of dense metal and volatile energy. There was nowhere to pull Ryan, no time to drag him clear. The coil was going to crush the kid's legs, and the resulting impact would likely rupture the casing, vaporizing them both. Wyatt roared, planting his heavy boots onto the deck. He threw his hands forward, catching the rolling cylinder bare-handed. The impact was a localized earthquake. Wyatt felt the shock wave travel up his arms, into his shoulders, and down his spine. The sheer kinetic force of the rolling mass slammed into him, pushing him backward. The rubber soles of his boots shrieked, smoking against the deck as he was pushed back 1/2 meter, digging his heels into the grooves to find purchase. Stop. He braced his core, utilizing every dense, gravity-forged muscle in his back and legs. He felt the tendons in his forearms pulling tight as steel cables. Stop. The coil slowed. Wyatt's right arm, already compromised, exploded in agony. The remaining stitches tore completely free. The laceration split wide open, raw and gaping. Hot red blood geysered over the sterile gray casing of the plasma coil, sizzling faintly as it hit the warm metal. Stop. With a final guttural shout that tore his throat, Wyatt locked his elbows. The coil stopped rolling. It rested heavily against his hands, less than 2 inches from Ryan's paralyzed, trembling form. Silence slammed into the cargo bay, absolute and deafening, broken only by Wyatt's ragged, wheezing gasps. He stayed locked in place for 5 agonizing seconds, making sure the cylinder's momentum was truly dead. Slowly, trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion, he stepped back, letting the coil rest harmlessly on the deck. He slumped against the cargo bay wall, sliding down until he hit the floor. He pulled his right glove off. It was filled with blood. His arm looked like a slaughtered animal. The iron smell in the air was suddenly overwhelming, burying the scent of ozone and grease. Footsteps clattered loudly across the deck. Voss and 3 other alien dock workers ran up the ramp. They stopped dead, staring at the scene. They looked at the massive plasma coil off its sled. They looked at Ryan, weeping softly on the floor, untouched. And then they looked at Wyatt. Wyatt expected gratitude. He expected someone to call for a medic. Instead, he saw what Corbin had seen in the clinic. The dock workers were backing away. Voss's mandibles were trembling. They weren't looking at a man who had just saved a co-worker's life. They were looking at the blood. They were looking at the deep crimson pooling on the deck, splattered across the heavy cargo, oxidizing in the air. They were looking at the deep dents Wyatt's fingers had left in the metal casing of the coil. "By the stars," Voss clicked softly, his voice devoid of its usual authority, replaced by a cold, crawling horror. "Your structure, the kinetic absorption." Wyatt closed his eyes, leaning his head against the cold steel of the bulkhead. He didn't feel like a miracle of kinetic absorption. He felt like a guy who was going to have a very bad time explaining this to Dr. Corbin. Wyatt coughed, tasting copper. "Just get someone to finish my shift. I'm taking my break." The walk back to the medical sector was a blurry, agonizing slog. Wyatt kept his right hand clamped tightly over his left bicep, applying manual pressure to the brachial artery to slow the bleeding. It wasn't working very well. The blood was warm and thick, sliding through his fingers and dripping onto the grated deck plating of the promenade. Every drop hissed faintly as it oxidized in the scrubbed station air. He left a trail. It wasn't a hero's trail. It was the messy, ugly reality of torn meat and ruptured veins. The station denizens gave him a wide berth. A group of multi-limbed merchants pressed themselves against a storefront window as he passed, their breathing apparatuses cycling frantically. A cleaning drone whirred out of an alcove to scrub the deck where his blood had fallen, only to short-circuit and emit a stream of black smoke as its chemical solvents reacted violently with the raw iron. Alarms were starting to blare in the distance. Low, throbbing sirens meant for chemical spills. Wyatt ignored them. The edges of his vision were static, fuzzy gray static that pulsed in time with his racing heart. He was thirsty, a deep, hollow thirst that scraped at the back of his throat. He kicked the swinging door of the clinic open with his steel-toed boot. It hit the wall with a resounding crack that echoed in the quiet reception area. Toby, the broad-shouldered receptionist, stood up, opening his mouth to yell. Then he saw Wyatt's arm. Toby slammed his hand down on a red button under his desk. A heavy containment field hummed to life, dropping a sheet of translucent energy between the desk and the waiting area. "Corbin," Wyatt croaked, his voice cracking. He leaned against the sterile white wall, leaving a long, rusty smear as he slid downward slightly. "Tell Corbin I'm back." The pneumatic door to the examination rooms hissed open. Dr. Corbin rushed out, a data pad in hand, already scolding. "Toby, why have you engaged the isolation?" Corbin stopped. The data pad slipped from his four-fingered grasp and shattered on the linoleum. "I popped a stitch, Doc," Wyatt said, offering a weak, lopsided grimace. Corbin didn't speak. He moved with a frantic, terrified energy. He bypassed the containment field controls, grabbed Wyatt by his good arm, and practically dragged him back into room 4. The doctor didn't bother with the lead-lined gloves this time. He went straight to the heavy trauma kits meant for industrial accidents. "Sit," Corbin ordered, shoving Wyatt onto the cold alloy table. "Do not move. Do not breathe heavily." "Kinda hard to avoid," Wyatt muttered, his chest heaving. The adrenaline was leaving his system, replaced by a cold, shivering nausea. Corbin cut the rest of Wyatt's ruined sleeve away with a thermal scalpel. The alien doctor stared at the wound. It was worse than before. The muscle fibers weren't just sliced, they were torn, shredded by the sheer mechanical stress of catching a 200-kilo falling mass. "You did not just pop a stitch," Corbin said, his synthetic translator voice shaking. He wiped a swath of blood away with an absorbent sponge, dropping it immediately into a hazardous waste chute. "The tensile strain required to rip these sutures. Human, what did you do?" "Dropped a plasma coil," Wyatt breathed, closing his eyes as the room began to spin lazily. "Had to catch it." "Catch it?" Corbin's hands froze over the wound. He looked up, his amber eyes wide pools of disbelief. "A heavy freight plasma coil? Wyatt, those weigh 200 standard kilos. If you intercepted a falling mass of that density, your skeletal structure should be dust. Your arms should be ripped from their sockets." "Bones are fine," Wyatt whispered. "Muscles just gave out a bit." Corbin shook his head slowly, a gesture of pure denial. He reached for a heavy metallic device that looked suspiciously like a staple gun. "Thread will not hold this. The tissue is too damaged, and your physical density rejects standard adhesives. I am going to have to use dermal staples. They are titanium alloy, used for micro hull breaches on scout ships." Wyatt cracked an eye open, looking at the heavy tool. "Sounds expensive." "I am billing the dockmaster," Corbin snapped. He positioned the device over the gaping wound. "This will hurt. I still have no anesthetics that will not stop your heart. Just do it." The first staple fired with a loud thwack. Wyatt didn't flinch. He couldn't. His body had run out of the energy required to panic. He just sat there, grinding his teeth together so hard his jaw popped, while Corbin drove heavy metal staples into his flesh, clamping the torn meat back together. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The sound was rhythmic, brutal, and entirely necessary. Wyatt smelled the ozone from the staple gun's pneumatic driver, mixed with the overpowering stench of his own blood. He felt the cold metal biting into his skin, forcing the torn edges together. It took 14 staples. By the time Corbin finished, Wyatt was drenched in a cold, clammy sweat. The arm looked like a Frankenstein patchwork, a brutal line of silver metal gripping pale, bruised skin. Corbin wrapped the arm tightly in a pressure bandage, his hands trembling slightly. "You are dehydrated. Your blood volume is critically low. I am administering a saline drip. It is just salt and water. Your body should not reject it." Wyatt nodded dumbly. He felt the sharp prick of an IV needle in the back of his left hand. The cool rush of fluid entering his vein was immediate relief. He let his head fall back against the wall. "Doc?" "Yes, Wyatt." Corbin was slouched in a wheeled chair, looking like he had aged a decade in 20 minutes. "Can I get a medical exemption for tomorrow's shift? I don't think Voss is going to let me back on the floor anyway." Corbin let out a sound that the translator failed to interpret. It sounded halfway between a laugh and a sob. "Wyatt, you're not going back to the docks, ever." Wyatt woke to the harsh, unforgiving glare of a sterilizer lamp. He blinked, turning his head away from the light. His mouth tasted like old pennies and dry dirt. He wasn't in room 4 anymore. This room was larger, colder, and distinctly lacking the cheap linoleum of the public clinic. The walls were brushed steel, the floor a seamless matte polymer. He was lying on a grav bed, floating 2 inches above the mattress, the anti-gravity field humming a low, soothing note beneath him. His right arm was encased in a sleek, rigid brace that pulsed with a faint blue light. The pain was gone. Not numbed, but entirely absent, replaced by a weird, tingling warmth. "You're awake!" The voice didn't come through a translator collar. It was spoken in flawless, unaccented basic. Wyatt turned his head. Sitting at a sleek, minimalist desk across the room was a man. Well, humanoid. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit that looked like it cost more than Wyatt's life insurance payout. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were a startling, icy blue. A nameplate on the desk read, "Administrator Hayes." "You human?" Wyatt croaked. His throat was sandpaper. "I am a station administrator," Hayes replied smoothly, folding his hands on the desk. "My species is irrelevant. We adapt to the visual and auditory preferences of those we are interrogating to reduce psychological friction." Wyatt snorted, pushing himself up into a sitting position. The grav bed adjusted instantly to support his back. "Interrogating? Did I break a station law by bleeding on the floor? Send me the cleaning bill." Hayes didn't smile. He pressed a button on his desk. The wall to Wyatt's left slid away, revealing an observation window. Behind the glass, suspended in a containment field, was the plasma coil. Wyatt recognized the gray casing, the faint blue glow from the seams. But something was wrong with it. The thick, hyperdense alloy of the cylinder was warped. Right in the center, where the metal was thickest, were 2 deep, concave depressions. They were handprints. The metal had buckled and folded inward, molded perfectly to the shape of human palms and fingers. Wyatt stared at it. He looked down at his own hands. They were calloused, scarred, and currently shaking slightly from the aftermath of adrenaline exhaustion. "That casing," Hayes said, his voice quiet, "is forged from neutron-compressed tungsten. It is designed to withstand the explosive force of a contained star. It does not dent. It does not bend." Wyatt swallowed hard. "Must be a manufacturing defect." "Do not insult my intelligence," Hayes said sharply. He stood up, walking slowly to the edge of the grav bed. When Foreman Voss reported that a dock worker had manually intercepted a free-falling coil, I assumed he was intoxicated. When station security retrieved the coil and found it structurally compromised by kinetic impact, I assumed sabotage. Hayes leaned in closer. He smelled like sterile air and cold calculations. "But then Dr. Corbin forwarded your medical scans to the Central Authority. He submitted an emergency biohazard alert regarding a creature pumping highly reactive iron through its veins, possessing a skeletal density that registers on geological scanners, and possessing muscle fibers that operate like industrial winches." "I'm just a guy," Wyatt said defensively. He hated this. He hated being treated like a lab rat. I haul freight. I pay my taxes. You are a weapon, Hayes corrected softly. I ran your profile through the Galactic Concord database. Humanity, a Class 9 Death World species. You evolved on a planet with crushing gravity, extreme temperature fluctuations, and hyper-aggressive microfauna. Your entire biological existence is an exercise in violent resistance. Earth isn't that bad, Wyatt muttered, though he knew it was a lie. He remembered the winters in Chicago, the way the wind physically hurt your face, the way the ice tried to break your bones every time you walked outside. We do not allow unregulated biological weapons on Kalin 9, Hayes stated. You caught a mass that should have vaporized a Veltrac and dented Starship-grade armor. What were you thinking? Wyatt looked at the administrator. He thought about Ryan. He thought about the kid's terrified, frozen face as the drone barreled toward him. He thought about the miserable, soul-crushing grind of the docks, the way the alien crews looked down on humans because they were poor, because they took the dirty jobs. I wasn't thinking, Wyatt said honestly. I was just trying to keep the kid from getting squashed. That's it. No master plan. No biological weapon deployment. Just reflex. Hayes stared at him for a long, uncomfortable moment. The icy blue eyes searched Wyatt's face for any sign of deception. Reflex, Hayes repeated. A reflex that bends tungsten. Look, Hayes, Wyatt sighed, leaning back against the grav bed. If you're going to fire me, fire me. If you're going to arrest me, get on with it. But don't look at me like I'm a monster. We're just built different. You guys build machines to handle the universe. We just let the universe beat on us until we got hard enough to handle it ourselves. Hayes turned back to the window, looking at the dented coil. Dr. Corbin was right. You are walking anomalies. Corbin's a good doc, Wyatt said. He stitched me up twice today without passing out. That deserves a medal. Hayes pressed another button on his desk. The observation window went opaque. He turned back to Wyatt, his expression suddenly shifting from bureaucratic coldness to something entirely different. Calculation. You are fired from the docks, Wyatt, Hayes said. Wyatt groaned, closing his eyes. Fantastic. Now I have to find a ship off this rock. You misunderstand, Hayes said smoothly. He walked over to the desk and picked up a sleek obsidian data pad. He tossed it onto the grav bed next to Wyatt's good hand. You are fired from the docks because your physical capabilities are entirely wasted moving boxes. The Galactic Concord has issues. Piracy on the outer rims. Hostile flora on expansion colonies. Situations where machines fail and our standard personnel die. Wyatt opened his eyes, looking at the data pad. You want me to be a mercenary. I want you to be a problem solver, Hayes corrected. The pay is quadruple your dock wages, full medical coverage, and you won't have to drink that synthesized sludge from the promenade ever again. Wyatt picked up the pad. It was heavy, cool to the touch. He thought about the cramped-smelling bunk in Sector 4. He thought about the ache in his bones that never truly went away. Then he looked at his right arm, stitched together with titanium staples, encased in a glowing blue brace. He had bled for this station today. He had broken himself to save one of theirs. Quadruple the pay, Wyatt said slowly, testing the words. And a hazard bonus, Hayes added. Because, frankly, you are the hazard. Wyatt stared at the screen. A cynical smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. All right, Hayes, Wyatt muttered. tapping his thumb against the acceptance glyph. "Show me what needs breaking." The dropship rattled like a tin can full of loose bolts. It was a stealth insertion craft, painted matte black, designed to slip past orbital sensors, but it rode the atmospheric turbulence of the dead moon like a mechanical bull. Wyatt sat strapped into the acceleration harness, his boots planted flat against the vibrating floor grates. The air inside the cabin tasted stale, heavily filtered, and laced with the sharp, acidic scent of alien fear pheromones. Sitting across from him were 3 conquered operatives. They were heavily armored in sleek, ceramic-plated hardsuits that hummed with internal power. Their helmets were sealed, their faces hidden behind opaque visors. They looked like professional killers. They smelled like terrified prey. Wyatt wore a standard-issue tactical vest over a heavy canvas shirt. He had refused the hard suit. The Concorde's armor was designed for species with fragile internal organs and low bone density. For Wyatt, the suit was a coffin. It restricted his movement, and its internal shock absorbers would misinterpret his natural kinetic output, locking the joints every time he threw a punch or braced for an impact. He carried a heavy kinetic repeater slug thrower, an ugly, brutal block of stamped steel that the alien quartermaster had handed over with a pair of long tongs. "Drop in 3 minutes," the pilot's voice crackled over the comms. "Target is an abandoned automated refinery. Rogue Defense AI has locked the sector. Standard EMP shielding is active. You will have to manually breach the command core." One of the operatives, a tall, spindly avian species whose call sign translated roughly to Finch, keyed his external speaker. "Human, you are under-equipped. The refinery's internal defense grids utilize high-yield sonic disruptors. The concussive waves will liquefy your vascular system." "I'll take my chances, Finch," Wyatt said, checking the magazine of his repeater. The heavy brass casings gleamed in the dim red jump light. "Just keep the automated drones off my back. I'll handle the doors." The dropship banked hard, slamming Wyatt against his harness. The titanium staples in his right arm pulled tight, a sharp, familiar pinch beneath his tactical sleeve. Dr. Corbin had signed off on his medical release with a look of profound, exhausted defeat. "You will tear yourself apart," Corbin had warned. "I'm getting paid a lot to do it," Wyatt had replied. The ship hit the landing zone with a bone-jarring crunch. The rear ramp dropped before the engines had fully cycled down. A wave of freezing thin air rushed into the cabin, carrying the smell of sulfur and crushed rock. "Go! Move!" Finch barked. The Concorde team surged down the ramp, their hard suits whirring as they took up defensive positions behind jagged outcroppings of basalt. Wyatt followed at a heavy jog. The gravity here was 0.8 Gs. It felt like walking on a thick carpet. His boots dug into the loose regolith, kicking up plumes of gray dust. The refinery loomed ahead, a massive, brutalist structure of rusted iron and black steel. It looked like a rotting tooth jutting out of the moon's surface. "We have movement," another operative announced. "Automated defense drones, coming from the gantry." "Engage," Finch ordered. The air erupted with the blinding snap of plasma fire. The Concorde team's weapons were elegant, searing precise holes through the incoming mechanical spiders. But there were too many of them. The sheer volume of suppressing fire from the drones forced the team to keep their heads down. Wyatt didn't take cover. He stepped out from behind the basalt rock, raised his heavy kinetic repeater, and pulled the trigger. The gun roared. It wasn't a clean, silent energy beam. It was a violent explosion of chemical propellant that kicked against Wyatt's shoulder with the force of a sledgehammer. The heavy lead slugs tore through the vacuum, smashing into the drones with brutal kinetic finality. Metal shattered. Optics burst. The recoil was massive, but Wyatt just leaned into it, letting his dense musculature absorb the shockwave, turning himself into a fleshy, breathing gun mount. He emptied the magazine in 10 seconds. 5 drones lay in smoking, ruined heaps. "Clear!" Wyatt shouted, ejecting the spent mag. It clattered against the rocks, hissing as it cooled. "Move to the door." They advanced to the primary airlock. It was a massive circular vault door made of reinforced permacrete and steel. The electronic keypad beside it was dead, shattered by a stray plasma bolt. "It is sealed," Finch said, scanning the door with a wrist-mounted device. "The hydraulic locks are engaged. We need a cutting torch. It will take 2 hours." "We don't have 2 hours," Wyatt muttered, looking at the defense turrets swiveling toward them on the upper ridge. "Cover me." Wyatt slung his rifle over his back and stepped up to the blast door. He wedged his heavy leather gloves into the microscopic seam between the 2 massive sliding panels. "Human, what are you doing?" Finch demanded. "That door weighs 6 tons. "It's on a track," Wyatt grunted, his voice tight. "The hydraulics are localized." He planted his boots wide. He closed his eyes. He thought about the 200-kilo plasma coil. He thought about the crushing gravity of Earth. He thought about the paycheck Administrator Hayes had promised him. He pulled. Nothing happened. The metal was cold, unforgiving, dead. Wyatt adjusted his grip. He dropped his center of gravity. He let the pain in his right arm flare, ignoring the warning bells his nervous system was screaming at his brain. He drew a deep breath of the canned, sulfur-tainted air, filling his massive lungs. Move. He fired every muscle fiber in his back, his shoulders, his legs. The thick cords of his neck stood out, rigid as steel cables. Blood vessels popped in the whites of his eyes, turning them a violent, bloodshot red. A horrific screeching sound echoed across the silent moon. It was metal tearing against metal. The hydraulic locks, designed to hold back explosive decompression, began to whine. Then, with a sound like a gunshot, the first lock snapped. Finch took a step back, his opaque visor reflecting the impossible scene. The human was vibrating with effort, a low, guttural growl vibrating in his chest. The second lock gave way, showering sparks onto the regolith. Wyatt didn't stop. He pushed outward, forcing the massive panels apart. Inch by agonizing inch, the door groaned open. The smell of stagnant, rotting oil rolled out from the dark interior. When the gap was wide enough for a hard suit to slip through, Wyatt let go. He slumped against the permacrete frame, gasping for air. His arms felt like they were filled with molten lead. He spat a thick wad of saliva onto the dirt. It was tinged pink with blood from a bitten lip. "Doors open," Wyatt wheezed, wiping his mouth with the back of a trembling glove. "After you." The conquered operatives didn't move for a long moment. They just stared at the broken hydraulic housing. Then, silently, Finch stepped through the gap. The clinic on Kalen 9 smelled exactly the same. Burnt hair, industrial bleach, and cheap sanitizers. Wyatt sat on the familiar brushed alloy table of room 4. He was shirtless. His torso looked like a piece of abstract art painted entirely in shades of plum, black, and sickly yellow. A sonic disruptor wave had caught him on the final push to the power core. It had knocked him through a glass partition and into a structural support beam. "Doctor," Corbin was running the localized scanner over Wyatt's chest. The device hummed softly. It didn't shriek this time. Corbin had meticulously reprogrammed the warning parameters to ignore the lethal quantities of iron pumping through the human's veins. 3 cracked ribs, Corbin announced, his synthetic voice echoing in the quiet room. He lowered the scanner. Massive soft tissue trauma, a minor concussion, and the titanium staples in your arm have torn the surrounding epidermis. "Do I get a lollipop this time, Doc?" Wyatt asked. His voice was gravelly, his throat raw from breathing sulfur dust for 4 hours. Corbin sighed. It was a profoundly human sound, coming from the olive-green alien. He pulled a biofoam applicator from the drawer. "You are an idiot, Wyatt. The sonic disruptor blast you took to the chest? It was calibrated to liquefy a chitin's carapace. It should have turned your heart into a fine paste." "My ribs took the brunt of it," Wyatt said, wincing as Corbin sprayed the freezing, numbing foam over his bruised side. "Yes, they absorbed the kinetic shockwave, microfractured to dissipate the force, and protected your vitals. It is horrifying," Corbin muttered, wrapping a thick compression bandage around Wyatt's torso. "You pay a terrible tax for your biology. Your body survives by enduring damage that would be fatal to anyone else. You do not deflect trauma. You absorb it." "The iron tax," Wyatt murmured, looking down at his hands. The knuckles were split, the skin raw and angry. "Precisely," Corbin said. He finished taping the bandage and stepped back, stripping his sterile gloves off. "You are healed enough to not die in the hallway. I suggest sleep. Copious amounts of it." The pneumatic door hissed open. Administrator Hayes stood in the threshold. He wore a different suit today, a sharp midnight blue, but his icy eyes were exactly the same. "Dr. Corbin," Hayes said, nodding politely. He looked at Wyatt's battered form. "I see our investment is requiring maintenance." "Your investment is a biological battering ram, Administrator," Corbin said dryly. "If you keep throwing him at reinforced bulkheads, eventually his skeletal structure will give out." "Noted," Hayes replied smoothly. He walked into the room and tossed a small, heavy rectangular chit onto the metal table next to Wyatt. Wyatt picked it up. The digital readout on the side glowed with a number that made his breath catch. It was more credits than he had made in 3 years on the cargo docks. It was enough to buy passage off this station, enough to buy a small ship, enough to never haul a plasma coil again. "The core is secured," Hayes said, his tone entirely business. "The Concorde appreciates your blunt force approach. Finch submitted a formal report. He requested that you never be assigned to his squad again." Wyatt chuckled, a low sound that irritated his cracked ribs. "Finch is a little high-strung." "Finch is terrified of you," Hayes corrected. "You broke a 6-ton hydraulic lock with your bare hands and bled all over a pristine control room. They view you as a feral animal." "And you?" Wyatt asked, looking up at the pale administrator. "What do you view me as?" Hayes paused. He looked at the deep bruises on Wyatt's chest, the bloodshot eyes, the sheer exhaustion radiating from the human's posture. "I view you as a necessary reality," Hayes said softly. "The galaxy is an elegant, highly advanced place, Wyatt. We build beautiful machines and fragile societies. But the universe itself is not elegant. It is violent. It is heavy. It crushes things. When our elegant solutions fail, we need something that knows how to survive being crushed." Hayes turned and walked toward the door. "Take 3 days. We have a pirate interdiction scheduled for the Outer Rim. I expect you to be functional." The door closed behind him. Wyatt sat in the silence of the clinic. He looked at Dr. Corbin. The alien physician was busy organizing his tools, deliberately not making eye contact. "You think I'm feral, Doc?" Wyatt asked quietly. Corbin stopped. He looked at Wyatt, his amber eyes tired, but entirely sincere.